She was kicked out of first class for looking out of place, but they had no idea she was married to the man who owned the airline. Danielle Carter James wasn't famous. She wasn't flashy. She didn't walk into rooms expecting to be noticed. And that morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in Georgia, all she wanted to do was make her flight, slide into her window seat, and sleep through the ride to San Francisco. It had been a long week. Her mom had just finished her third round of chemo, and Danielle had flown out to stay with her in Mobile. She was drained, emotionally and physically, but too proud to say it out loud. She wore black leggings, a soft pair of Nike sneakers, and one of her husband's old hoodies. The oversized gray cotton swallowed her small frame and still carried his cologne faintly in the sleeves. It made her feel safe. In one hand, she held her phone and boarding pass. In the other, a to-go cup of chai tea she barely sipped. She had noise-canceling headphones slung around her neck, though she hadn't played anything yet. Her eyes were tired, her back ached, and her heart was heavy. People didn't see that, though. They saw a young black woman in a hoodie standing alone at gate A23. No makeup, no suitcase with designer tags, no wedding ring today. She'd taken it off to wash dishes for her mom and forgot to put it back on. She wasn't performing success. She didn't have the energy. Still, Danielle was no stranger to first class. Her husband, Gregory James, had made sure of that. He booked her flights himself, always under her maiden name, always early boarding, always first class. It wasn't about flexing. It was about peace and comfort. She'd earned that much. So when they called Zone 1, Danielle stepped forward quietly, scanned her pass, nodded at the gate agent, and walked down the jet bridge. The cabin doors were already open. The scent of fresh coffee and lemon-scented wipes hung in the air. She turned into the first row and found her seat, 3A, window. She slipped in, tossed her hoodie over her head, and exhaled slowly. For a moment, everything felt okay again, until it didn't. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the woman in 2A glance at her, then glance again. The man in 1C lowered his phone and stared for a beat longer than necessary. One of the flight attendants, tall, red lipstick, tight bun, did a double take while walking down the aisle. Danielle had seen it before. She just didn't think today would be one of those days. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a paperback she hadn't finished since February, flipped to where the receipt marked her place, tried to focus. But the air in the cabin felt different now, charged, like something was about to happen. Like she didn't belong here. Like someone had decided that for her. The flight attendant reappeared. This time she didn't smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said in a voice too polite to be polite. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Danielle blinked. "Sorry?" "Your boarding pass. We just need to verify your seat." She handed it over. No attitude, no hesitation. The woman looked at it, then looked at Danielle, then back at the pass. A tight smile. "I'll be right back." Danielle tucked her book away. The tea now sat cold in the cup holder. Her hoodie suddenly felt too warm. She leaned back in her seat, eyes fixed on the back of 2A's head, trying to stay calm, trying not to imagine where this was going. But she already knew. Danielle stared out the window, but her mind was nowhere near the tarmac. A quiet buzz of movement stirred in the cabin. The sound of zippers, pages turning, belts clicking into place. People settling in. Meanwhile, she sat completely still, clutching the frayed sleeve of her husband's hoodie between her thumb and forefinger like a lifeline. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her seat, but it was the first time it felt so coordinated. The flight attendant returned, this time with another crew member, shorter, broader shoulders, wearing a supervisor tag clipped to her blouse. Danielle noticed how they kept their voices low, how they didn't ask the older white man in 1C anything, didn't glance at the young couple in 3B and 3C. All eyes were on her. "Ma'am," the supervisor said gently, "we're showing an issue with this seat. Would you mind stepping into the aisle for just a moment while we sort it out?" Danielle looked at her, not with anger, just tired confusion. "I'm in 3A, she replied, holding up the digital boarding pass again. "It's on my ticket." "Yes, we understand. We just need to verify something real quick." She stood slowly, slipping her tote bag over one shoulder. Her headphones swung loose around her neck. As she stepped into the aisle, she caught the glance from the woman in 2A again. The kind of glance that didn't ask questions. The kind that already had the answer it wanted. And then, just behind her, a voice. soft, but meant to be heard. Maybe she thought she could sneak up here. Danielle turned her head slightly. She didn't see who said it, didn't want to. She wasn't about to give anyone the satisfaction of a reaction. Not today. She just took a slow breath and kept her eyes forward. The crew motioned her to stand near the galley as they whispered back and forth, scanning screens, clicking into passenger logs. She could see their expressions, hesitant, annoyed, a bit nervous now, like they were trying to find a reason that made this okay. "What's going on?" Danielle asked quietly, looking between them. "It looks like there may have been a duplicate booking," the supervisor answered, avoiding eye contact. "On my seat?" "It's possible," she said, typing again. "We're just checking on it." Danielle nodded once. "Okay, so why are y'all only asking me to move?" Neither of them answered that. At that moment, the gate agent walked into the cabin, waving slightly to the crew. He glanced over at Danielle, then at the manifest in his hand, then froze. His brow furrowed. Danielle could see something click in his face, but before he could speak, the original flight attendant leaned in and said, "Would you mind taking a seat in coach until we get this resolved? We're trying to keep things moving on time." Danielle blinked slowly. She was stunned, not because she hadn't seen it coming, but because it was being done with such polished control. Like it wasn't racism, just procedure. Like it wasn't humiliating, just protocol. Like the cabin was a courtroom and she'd already lost the case. She glanced down the aisle toward economy. It looked long, narrow, endless. She looked back at 3A, her seat. A man in a navy suit was already sliding into it. Without a word, Danielle turned, walked past the curtain, and made her way down the aisle. Row 23, middle seat. She didn't argue, didn't fuss, just sat down and stared straight ahead. The man beside her didn't say anything. Neither did the woman in the window seat. But their faces said enough. They'd seen what happened, and maybe they didn't agree, but they weren't about to get involved. Danielle pulled her hoodie tighter, pulled it low over her eyes, and for the first time that day, she felt small. But back at the gate, someone else had seen it all too, and he wasn't going to stay quiet. Gregory James had always been a quiet observer. That's what made him dangerous in boardrooms. He listened more than he spoke. Watched how people moved when they thought no one important was looking. And from the tall windows near gate A21, that's exactly what he was doing. His return flight to San Diego wasn't boarding for another hour. He was just there to see Danielle off, like he always did. Even after 12 years of marriage, they never left each other without a hug, a look, a "call me when you land." Gregory had watched her walk through the jet bridge, tired but composed. He'd smiled, sipping his coffee, already imagining her curled up against the window seat, hoodie half over her face, probably asleep before takeoff. But now, he could feel something was wrong. She'd texted him 2 words. "They trippin'." That was all it took. He moved closer to the gate, watched a gate agent hurry past with a clipboard, heard whispers from nearby passengers. "That girl in the hoodie. I don't think she's supposed to be up there." One even said, "Some people will try anything these days." Gregory's hands tightened around his cup. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit, no fancy watch, just jeans, a black pullover, and running shoes. To most people, he looked like someone's coach, maybe an engineer, not a billionaire, not the man who started JX Air, a private first airline that had become a top domestic carrier in just 6 years. He started it in his garage. Now he owned it, and they'd just kicked his wife out of first class. He walked over to the gate desk calmly. No fuss, just that quiet authority that made people look twice. "Excuse me," he said to the gate agent. The man looked up, distracted. "Yes, sir?" Gregory gave a small smile. "You just downgraded a passenger, Danielle Carter James, 3A. The agent hesitated. "There was an issue with the manifest. We had a duplicate." "No, you didn't," Gregory cut in, still calm. "Her ticket was valid. I booked it myself." That made the agent pause. "Are you?" "Yes, Gregory James." He pulled out his ID slowly. "Founder, CEO, board chair." The agent's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Gregory leaned in, his voice quiet but sharp. "I want the name of the person who asked her to move. The flight attendant, the supervisor, all of them." "Yes, sir, I can. I'll get someone." "Don't bother, she's already on the plane. But you tell your crew they just profiled my wife, kicked her out of a seat she paid for, on the airline I own, and did it because she wore a hoodie and had no wedding ring. Let me be clear, this won't be handled quietly. He turned around and walked away before the man could respond. Back on the plane, Danielle sat stone still in row 23. Her phone buzzed again. I'm handling it. Just breathe. That was all he sent. She stared at the message for a long moment. No tears, no anger, just the odd relief that comes when the people who love you remind you you weren't crazy. You weren't imagining it. She looked down the aisle, and for the first time, she hoped they knew who she really was. Because Danielle wasn't just the woman in the hoodie. She was the one holding half of a billion-dollar empire. And these folks, they were about to learn that the hard way. But the lesson wouldn't just come from her husband. It would come from the world watching next. By the time the plane touched down in San Francisco, Danielle hadn't spoken a single word. Not to the crew, not to the passengers around her, not even to Gregory, who had tried to call during the layover in Dallas, where her flight had unexpectedly been rerouted. She just texted back, "We'll talk when I land." She needed space, not because she was afraid of what she might say, but because she wasn't sure she'd be able to stop once she started. The moment the wheels hit the ground, the cabin lights flicked on. Passengers stretched and checked their phones. She stayed seated, still, small, her hands resting in her lap. In the seat pocket in front of her was the unopened tea, now cold, and the book she never got the chance to read. As the plane rolled to the gate, the lead flight attendant made her final walk down the aisle. She didn't acknowledge Danielle, didn't glance her way. Danielle caught the name tag this time, R. Thatcher, noted. Then something unexpected happened. A woman seated across the aisle, white, maybe mid-60s, sharp eyes, tailored coat, leaned toward Danielle. "I saw what they did to you," she said softly. "It wasn't right." Danielle looked at her. "I wanted to say something," the woman added, "but I didn't know if I'd make it worse." Danielle didn't answer. She didn't have to. The pause said enough. The woman nodded like she understood. "Just so you know, people noticed." Danielle forced a small smile, more out of politeness than gratitude. She wasn't mad at the woman. She just didn't want comfort. Not now. Not from someone who could afford to stay quiet. When she finally stepped off the plane, her phone lit up with notifications. Texts from Gregory, missed calls, a few alerts from group chats. But then one headline stopped her in her tracks. Billionaire CEO of JX Air blasts airline staff for profiling his wife mid-flight. JX Air under fire after CEO's wife kicked from first class. Gregory James calls out his own airline. My wife was treated like a suspect, not a passenger. Danielle blinked. Somehow, it was already out there. She called Gregory. He answered on the first ring. "You okay?" "I just landed," she said. "I saw the news." "I wasn't going to let it slide," he said. "I called the board. I released a statement. HR already launched an investigation. The crew's been pulled from duty until further notice." Gregory, he paused. "Yeah?" "I didn't want this to become a thing." "I know," he said, "but it already was a thing, Dee. Just because you didn't scream doesn't mean it wasn't loud. They humiliated you." She exhaled through her nose. "You're right. I was tired. I still am." "I know you are. Come home. I'm sending the car." As she walked toward baggage claim, eyes tracked her now. Two flight attendants whispered to each other. A man across the terminal stared at her, then looked back at his phone like he recognized her face from somewhere. She didn't say anything, but inside something shifted. It wasn't just about a seat, or a row, or a flight. It was about how people looked at her when she wasn't dressed a certain way, how they made decisions about her worth in half a second, how quickly they went from smiling to suspicious, and how easily they tried to sweep it under the rug. But what happened on that plane was no longer just her story. It was everybody's, and the world was about to pick a side. By the time Danielle reached her driveway in Palo Alto, she had over 300 new text messages. Not just from friends and family, but people she hadn't heard from in years. College classmates, former coworkers, even folks she barely knew, now flooding her inbox with things like, "I'm so sorry," "Saw what happened," "Standing with you." They picked the wrong one. Her name was everywhere now, and so was her face, Mestizo Salto. Photos from the plane, screenshots from the flight manifest, a grainy video clip of her standing in the aisle clutching her hoodie with the caption, "She kept her cool, even when they didn't." The media had caught fire. National talk shows, blogs, even late-night hosts were dissecting it all. Why was she asked to move? Would they have done this to a white woman? Why didn't the crew double-check the manifest before humiliating her? People debated, defended, denied, but the truth didn't need to shout. It had already been seen. Gregory's statement had done what Danielle never intended. It turned a private moment into a public reckoning, and it did so with clarity. No one, no matter their appearance, name, or skin, should be treated like an intruder in a seat they rightfully paid for. JX Air is built on dignity, not doubt. And if my wife can be treated this way, so can your mother, your sister, your daughter. That part hit people hard. Even folks who had never cared before found themselves uncomfortable. Some made excuses, others opened their eyes. Employees at JX Air began speaking up, sharing their own stories of bias on the job. Things brushed off, covered up, or handled internally. It was bigger now. Danielle stayed home for the next 3 days, turned off her phone, made banana pancakes, played Miles Davis records in the background while folding laundry, let the noise run outside while her peace stayed inside. But even then, peace was interrupted. A letter arrived, handwritten, no return address. Inside, one simple line. "I was the one who whispered about you. I'm sorry." No name, no explanation. Danielle stared at it for a long time. She didn't feel vindicated. She didn't even feel angry. She just felt tired. But she folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer where she kept her mother's get well cards. Because even if it was cowardly, even if it was late, it was something. And too often, people didn't even give you that. By the end of the week, JX Air announced mandatory equity training for all crew, anonymous reporting tools for profiling incidents, a revised boarding policy that no longer allowed crew to remove passengers without full verification from central dispatch. The changes were real, concrete, tangible, and they started because a woman in a hoodie refused to argue and a man who loved her refused to stay silent. But not everyone clapped. Some people still had something to say, and Danielle was ready to answer without saying a word. 3 weeks later, Danielle stood backstage at the Bayfront Women's Equity Summit in Oakland. She hadn't planned to speak. The organizers had reached out just days before, after the story made national headlines, asking her to share a few words about what had happened. At first, she said no. She wasn't an activist. She wasn't a public figure. She was just someone who got treated like she didn't belong. But that's exactly why they wanted her. So now, here she was, hoodie and all. She stepped onto the stage in front of nearly 2,000 women, young, old, black, white, immigrant, queer, corporate, creative. The whole room went silent. She didn't read from notes. She didn't speak like a politician. She just told the truth. "I didn't speak up on that plane," she said, her voice steady. "Not because I was afraid. Not because I didn't have the words. I stayed quiet because I was exhausted, tired of explaining, tired of proving, tired of asking people to see me when they'd already decided who I was." Some in the crowd nodded slowly. She continued, "I wasn't dressed how they thought a first-class passenger should look. No ring on my finger that day, no heels, no name they recognized. So to them, I didn't belong, and they treated me like a problem instead of a person." She paused, took a breath. And what hurt the most wasn't the seat I lost. It was the dignity they took without even asking. A long silence followed. Then a woman near the front stood up. Then another, and another, until the entire room was on their feet. Danielle didn't cry. She didn't soak in the applause. She just smiled, small, real, and said, "I don't want anyone's pity. I want us to stop giving people the power to question our presence. You belong. Wherever you are, however you look, whatever name you carry, you belong." After the event, dozens of women came up to her. Some hugged her, some just touched her hand. One, a teenage girl wearing her own oversized hoodie, simply whispered, "Thank you for not yelling. I needed to see that." And that was it. Not a lawsuit, not revenge, just change. Gregory waited for her outside, leaning against the car, arms crossed. "How'd it go?" he asked. Danielle looked up at him. I didn't punch anyone in the face, so I think it went well. He grinned. Proud of you. They rode in silence for a while, not because there was nothing to say, but because, for once, peace didn't have to be earned. It just existed. Danielle opened the window, let the wind mess up her hair, rested her head on Gregory's shoulder as they stopped at a red light, and in that quiet moment, she thought, they tried to shrink me, but I stayed whole, and the whole world saw it. This is the part of the story where we're supposed to say the end, but really, it's the beginning. For anyone watching this, just remember, don't let anyone tell you where you don't belong. Your seat, your place, your presence, it's not up for debate. And if they ever make you feel small, just do what Danielle did. Stand tall in your hoodie, say nothing, and let the world speak for you. If you've ever been overlooked, doubted, or told you were too much or not enough, this story is for you. Share it. Tag someone who needs to hear it. And next time you walk into a room, remember, you belong.